The knife went still in her hand 3 seconds before the doors opened. Josephine Marlowe had been catering weddings for 6 years, and she'd learned to feel a room shift before she saw why. The air in the Ashcombe Estate kitchen changed first. The junior staff straightening, someone's spoon clattering into a sink they hadn't finished rinsing, and then the doors at the far end of the pantry corridor swung open, and Nathaniel Cole walked in wearing a charcoal suit that had never once touched a dry cleaner's rack twice. She didn't stop plating. That was the detail he would remember, months later, when people asked him when it started. Not the dress she wore, not her face, though both were fine enough. It was that a stranger walked into a room specifically built around his arrival, and she kept spooning beurre blanc over a scallop, like he was a delivery driver checking a signature. Mr. Cole, the estate's event director, a tight, anxious woman named Priya, appeared at his elbow like she'd been launched from a cannon. "We weren't expecting you until 4. "I wasn't expecting to come at all," Nathaniel said. His eyes were already past Priya, past the gleaming counters, and the trays of hors d'oeuvres arranged like jewelry in a case. "But my mother mentioned the tasting was happening today, and I realized I've never actually met the person cooking my own wedding dinner." "That would be Chef Marlowe." Priya gestured, a little too eagerly, toward the woman at the counter. "Josephine, this is—" "I know who he is." Josephine wiped her hands on her apron and looked up, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Nathaniel Cole felt a stranger actually look at him, instead of at the 11-figure net worth standing behind his eyes. "You're 20 minutes early, and I don't have the lamb course ready. You'll have to start with the scallop." There was a pause. Priya's face did something complicated. "That's fine," Nathaniel said. "I wasn't asking permission." Josephine slid a plate across the steel counter toward him. "Sit if you want, or don't. Some people prefer to eat standing so they can leave faster if they hate it." He didn't sit. He picked up the fork she hadn't offered him and ate the scallop standing at the counter like a man in a diner, and something around his mouth loosened in a way none of his family's employees had seen in 3 years. "It's good," he said. "I know." She was already turning back to the stove. "Tell me something useful next time. Good doesn't help me fix anything." Nathaniel Cole, who ran a private equity firm that controlled 14,000 jobs and who had not been spoken to like a mildly competent adult in longer than he wanted to admit, laughed. It came out rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened all season. "The acidity's a little sharp against the champagne we're serving," he said. "Everything else is perfect." Josephine turned around slowly. She studied him the way she studied a dish that had come back from a table half-eaten, trying to figure out what had actually gone wrong and whether it was fixable. "Huh," she said. "Okay, I can work with that." She was 29 years old and she owned exactly one restaurant, a narrow room on the wrong end of Sycamore Street with 11 tables and a lease that came due in 4 months. Marlowe and daughter had her father's name over the door, even though her father had been dead for 6 years, because she hadn't been able to bring herself to paint over it, and because half her regulars still came in, asking after Big Tom's cooking, and she let them believe, gently, that some of it was still there. The wedding contract from the Cole family had come through a caterer's referral network, and it was the kind of job that could either save her restaurant or put it so deep in debt to expensive ingredients and rented equipment that she'd lose it faster than the lease ever would have. She'd said yes, because saying no to $400,000 was not something Josephine Marlowe knew how to do. She had not expected the groom to be the kind of man who asked about acidity. Nathaniel Cole was 34, and by every metric that showed up in a magazine profile, he had already won. Cole Whitfield Capital managed $9 billion. His face had been on the cover of a business quarterly under the headline, "The Youngest Man in the Room," which had embarrassed him more than it had flattered him, because the room in question had been his father's funeral reception, held 11 days after his father's heart stopped in an airport lounge in Geneva. His mother, Eleanor Cole, had spent the 18 months since then doing what she did best, which was securing the family's position through architecture nobody else could see until it was already built around them. The marriage to Vivian Ashcombe, daughter of the Ashcombe shipping fortune, heir to a controlling stake in the very estate where the wedding tasting was now happening, had been presented to Nathaniel as a partnership. A merger, dressed in white lace. Two companies that needed each other's balance sheets, bound together by two people who had met 4 times in 18 months and who were, by mutual and unspoken agreement, perfectly polite strangers. He had said yes because saying no felt like abandoning a company his father had built with his own hands, and a mother who had already buried a husband and could not, Nathaniel believed, survive burying the family's future as well. He had not expected to feel anything at his own wedding tasting, except the low hum of obligation. If you've ever fallen for someone who saw you as a person instead of a headline, stay with this one, subscribe now, because it only gets more complicated from here. The lamb course came out at 4:40, and Nathaniel Cole, who had a board call at 5, did not leave. "You're going to be late," Josephine said, not looking up from the pan she was resting. "I'm aware. For your own company." "I'm aware of that too." He leaned against the counter, tie loosened, looking more like a man on a lunch break than the person whose name was on the building. "What's the daughter part of Marlowe and daughter? I looked you up. There's no mention of a Marlowe Sr. anywhere current." Something in her face closed like a door drawn on a soft hinge. Quiet, controlled, but final. "My father. He opened the place. I kept the name. Is he? He died. 6 years ago. Heart." She plated the lamb without looking at him. "You can ask Priya for the wine list. I have 4 more courses and a business call of my own to make, so." He left 10 minutes later. He did not go to his board call. He sat in the back of his car in the estate's circular drive for 11 minutes, thinking about a woman who had lost her father the same way he was about to lose the version of himself who still believed marriage should feel like something other than a signature. They saw each other 6 more times over the following 5 weeks. The appointment record would later reveal, when Priya's assistant compiled it out of habit, that Nathaniel Cole had personally attended every single one of Marlowe and daughter's contracted planning sessions, a level of groom involvement that no one on the Ashcombe wedding staff had ever seen from a man whose own mother was running 80% of the wedding's actual decisions. At the cake tasting, he told her, unprompted, that his father used to bring home a specific lemon cake from a bakery in Rome every time he traveled there, and that Nathaniel hadn't eaten lemon cake since the funeral because it made his chest hurt in a way he didn't have language for. Josephine, without asking permission, took the lemon option off the tasting table and replaced it with a dark chocolate espresso cake instead. She didn't explain why, and he didn't ask her to. At the linen fitting, which he had no business attending, and Priya told him so twice, he found Josephine in the service kitchen arguing on the phone with a produce supplier who'd shorted her order by 40 pounds of heirloom tomatoes 3 days before a 120-cover tasting menu for a different client entirely, a wedding that had nothing to do with him. He listened to her hang up, swear quietly at the ceiling, and start recalculating a menu on a legal pad, with the speed of someone doing triage. "I know a produce distributor in the Flatiron Warehouse District who owes me a favor," he said. "I can have 40 pounds of tomatoes at your other kitchen in 90 minutes. I don't need you to fix my problems." "I know," he said. "I'm offering because it's 90 minutes of my time, and it fixes your night, not because I think you can't handle it yourself." Those are different things. She looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that Priya, watching from the doorway, would later tell the head florist that something had happened in that kitchen that had nothing to do with linens. "Fine," Josephine said, "but you're not doing it for a thank you dinner or whatever billionaires think this buys them." "I didn't say anything about a dinner." "You were going to." "I was," he admitted, and for the second time in 5 weeks, he laughed. That same rusty, surprised sound. 40 pounds of tomatoes. 90 minutes. No dinner. I promise. The tomatoes arrived in 81 minutes. There was no dinner that night. There was, however, a text message at 1 a.m. The tomatoes were perfect, thank you. And a reply 40 seconds later that suggested Nathaniel Cole had been awake and waiting and had not been checking his phone for a business reason at all. Vivian Ashcombe was not a villain, and the story would eventually make that plain, but for now she existed at the edges of both their lives the way a deadline exists, inevitable, approaching, impossible to argue with. She and Nathaniel had dinner twice a month, arranged by their mothers, conversations that moved with the polished emptiness of two people reciting lines from a play neither had chosen to be in. She was kind to him. He was kind to her. Neither of them had ever once, in 18 months, said a single true thing to the other. He did not think about Vivian when he thought about the kitchen at Ashcombe Estate. He noticed this, the way you notice a light left on in a room you thought was empty, and he did not know yet what to do about it. The florist's showroom sat 2 buildings down from the estate's main kitchen, and it was there, in the 4th week, that Nathaniel got his first real look at what Josephine's life actually cost her. Denny had come along to help transport centerpiece samples, and while Josephine argued with the florist over whether the peonies would hold up in June heat, her phone buzzed against the counter, again and again, until she finally snatched it up with the particular irritation of someone who already knew who was calling. "It's the health inspector's office," she muttered, stepping into the hallway. Nathaniel, ostensibly examining a sample arrangement, positioned himself close enough to hear, without meaning to eavesdrop, and then found he couldn't make himself walk away. "No, I understand the citation," Josephine was saying, low and clipped. "I fixed the ventilation issue in February. I have the receipts. I need someone to come re-inspect before the wedding season starts, or I lose 2 of my biggest contracts, and one of them is worth more than my restaurant makes in a year." A pause. Her knuckles went white around the phone. 3 weeks, she said. "You're telling me 3 weeks, and if I don't pass, I lose the Ashcombe wedding entirely. Is that right?" Another pause. "Great. That's great. Thank you so much for your flexibility." She hung up and stood very still in the hallway, and Nathaniel watched her take one long breath before she reassembled her face into the composed, unbothered expression she wore for clients, and walked back into the showroom like nothing had happened at all. He didn't say anything that day. But that night, a health and safety consultant named Marguerite Oyeleron, the same woman Cole Whitfield Capital used to audit compliance at its portfolio company's manufacturing sites, received an email requesting an expedited, discreet consultation for a small restaurant on Sycamore Street, paid for anonymously through a corporate wellness initiative that technically existed, on paper, for exactly this kind of thing. Josephine never learned who had arranged it. She passed her re-inspection 11 days later, with a perfect score, and told Denny it must have been a fluke, and did not think to wonder why the inspector had specifically praised ventilation work she hadn't actually finished paying for yet. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people whose politeness has a price tag, and Nathaniel had lived inside it since his father's funeral, without fully naming it. His mother loved him, he never doubted that, but her love had always come wrapped in structure, in 5-year plans and succession strategies, the way some parents wrap love in casseroles. His friends, if he was honest with himself, were mostly colleagues who had learned to laugh at the correct moments. His fiancée called him Nathaniel, in the same tone she might use for a business associate whose name she was careful to get right. Josephine called him nothing at all for the first 3 weeks. Then, somewhere around the tomato incident, she started calling him Cole, flat and unceremonious, the way you'd address a coworker you respected, but hadn't decided to like yet. He found he preferred it to every other name anyone had called him in years. The rehearsal for the rehearsal dinner, an absurdity Nathaniel found himself unable to stop pointing out to anyone who would listen, took place on a Sunday evening in the estate's smaller ballroom, with Eleanor Cole presiding over table placements like a general reviewing troop formations. Josephine was there to walk the serving staff through timing, and Nathaniel found himself, again, somewhere he had no professional reason to be. "You keep showing up," Josephine said, catching him lingering near the service entrance during a lull. "I keep having reasons. Do you?" "Tonight my reason is that the seating chart puts me next to my great-aunt Dorothea for 4 hours, and I would rather stand in a hallway near the kitchen listening to you argue with a wine rep about decanting times." He said it lightly, but something under it wasn't light at all, and she heard the difference. "You could just tell your mother you don't want to sit next to your great-aunt." "I could," he agreed. "I've found, over the last month, that there are a great many things I could simply say, that I have spent my entire adult life not saying instead." Josephine didn't answer that directly. She glanced past him, toward the ballroom, where the sound of silverware being counted drifted faintly through the doorway, and when she looked back at him, her expression had gone careful, guarded, the wall starting to go up brick by brick even as she stood there. "I have work to do, Cole. I know." He didn't move to stop her. "I'll see you at the tasting Thursday. You always do." Josephine's restaurant lease came due on a Tuesday in March, 6 weeks before the wedding, and she did not tell Nathaniel Cole about it, because Josephine Marlowe had built her entire adult life around the principle that she did not need anyone's rescue, least of all a client's, least of all a man who was about to marry someone else, in front of 400 guests and a string quartet flown in from Vienna. Big Tom Marlowe had taught his daughter to cook the way some fathers teach their children to fish, patiently, stubbornly, with a running commentary of small corrections that only later revealed themselves as love. He'd run Marlowe and Daughter for 22 years before the heart attack that took him on a Sunday morning while he was prepping stock for the week, standing at the exact stove Josephine still used every day. She had been 23, 3 years out of culinary school, working a line cook job at a hotel restaurant she hated, and she'd walked into her father's kitchen the following Monday and never left it again. People assumed the restaurant's survival since then had been a triumph. Mostly it had been math, brutal, unglamorous math, the kind that kept Josephine awake doing spreadsheets at midnight, the kind that meant she hadn't taken a real vacation in 4 years and hadn't been on a second date with anyone since her 20s, because dating required energy she'd already spent keeping the lights on in a building with her father's name over the door. She loved the restaurant the way you love a person who's difficult and expensive, and yours anyway. She had never once, in 6 years, considered letting it go, which was why the phone call with her landlord, 2 weeks before the lease deadline, had left her sitting on the restaurant's back steps for 20 minutes before she could make herself go back inside. About it that same night, she told her
over
sous
a beer
chef after
Denny.
service, the two of them sitting on overturned milk crates in the alley behind Marlowe and Daughter, because the dining room's chairs felt too much like customers might be listening. "Landlord wants $68,000 up front for the new lease term," she said. "I've got the wedding money coming in May. If I don't sign by April 1st, he's already got another tenant lined up. Some vape shop." "A vape shop instead of your dad's restaurant." "A vape shop instead of my restaurant," she corrected, and Denny had the decency not to push on it. "What about the wedding money?" "The wedding money comes in May. The lease is due April 1st. Math doesn't care about my feelings, Denny." She didn't say the rest of it, which was that some nights, driving home from the Ashcombe estate with flour still under her nails, she found herself thinking about a man with tired eyes, and a dead father, and a lemon cake he couldn't eat, and wondering what it would feel like if just once someone looked at her and saw the whole person instead of the useful function she performed. She didn't say it because saying it made it real, and real things could be taken away, and Josephine Marlowe had learned that lesson at 23 years old, standing over a hospital bed, and she had not unlearned it since. The rehearsal dinner was 4 weeks out when everything changed. Nathaniel found Josephine in the estate's walk-in refrigerator at 9 at night, inventorying stock for the final menu, her breath fogging in the cold, And he said the thing he had been not saying for 5 weeks in the plainest words he had. I don't want to marry her. Josephine didn't look up from her clipboard. That's not something you should be telling your caterer. You're not just my caterer. I have to be. Her voice was steady, but her pen had stopped moving. In 6 weeks, you're going to stand at an altar and marry Vivian Ashcombe, and I'm going to be in a service kitchen 40 yards away, making sure the salmon doesn't overcook. And that is the entire shape of what we are allowed to be to each other. So don't. Don't what? Don't say things like that to me in a walk-in refrigerator at 9 o'clock at night like it doesn't mean anything, because it means something to me, and I can't afford for it to. The refrigerator hummed around them. Somewhere above, a compressor clicked on. It's not a real marriage, Nathaniel said quietly. It never was. It's a merger. Ashcombe Holdings needs Cole Whitfield's capital position, and my mother needs the company stabilized before the board tries to push her out. And Vivian? He stopped. Started again. Vivian's in love with someone else, her father's estate manager. She told me at dinner 3 weeks ago, the same night I couldn't stop thinking about tomatoes. Vivian's clipboard lowered an inch. She's in love with someone else, and you're still marrying her? She asked me not to say anything. Her father would end the estate manager's career and probably his family's tenancy on the property. She's trying to protect him the only way she knows how, by going through with a marriage that keeps everyone paid and quiet and safe, and hoping the rest sorts itself out later. I understand that impulse better than I'd like to. That's not a marriage, Nathaniel. That's a hostage situation with a seating chart. He almost smiled. Almost. I know. Then why? Because if I walk away, the merger collapses, my mother's position on the board collapses with it, and 1,100 people at Cole Whitfield lose their jobs inside a fiscal quarter. That's not a hypothetical. I've seen the modeling. He rubbed a hand over his face. I keep telling myself that's a good enough reason to spend my whole life performing a marriage that isn't real. And then I come here, and you tell me my acidity's off, and none of the reasons feel good enough anymore. The walk-in was silent except for the hum of the compressor and both of their breathing, visible now in small white clouds. I have to finish this inventory, Josephine said finally, very quietly. Okay. And you have somewhere else to be. I do. Neither of them moved for 11 more seconds. Then Nathaniel Cole turned and walked out of the refrigerator, and Josephine Marlowe stood alone among the stacked cases of champagne, meant for a wedding she was starting to dread cooking for, and pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, like she could physically hold something in place. He just told her the wedding isn't real, and she just told him it doesn't matter. If you think it's about to get worse before it gets better, you're right. Hit subscribe now, because the next part changes everything. Josephine did the thing she always did when a situation became too large to hold steady in her hands. She built a wall out of professionalism and stood behind it. For the next 2 weeks, she communicated with the Ashcombe wedding staff exclusively through Priya. She stopped attending tastings in person and sent Denny instead. When Nathaniel called, twice, both times late at night, both times to a phone she watched ring out on the counter beside her cutting board, she let it go to voicemail and did not listen to either message for 4 days. She told herself this was the responsible thing, the professional thing. The thing her father would have told her to do, if her father were still alive to tell her anything, which he wasn't, which was precisely the kind of thought that kept her awake at 2 a.m., doing lease math on a legal pad instead of sleeping. The lease deadline arrived on a Tuesday. She did not have $68,000. The landlord, a reasonable man named Harmon, who had known her father for 20 years, gave her 1 additional week, out of respect for Big Tom's memory, and told her, kindly but plainly, that 1 week was all he had to give. She signed nothing. She lay awake that Tuesday night running numbers that refused to add up no matter how she arranged them, and somewhere around 3 a.m., She found herself standing in the empty dining room of Marlowe and daughter, one hand flat against the cool wood of the bar her father had built himself out of reclaimed church pews, trying to decide whether keeping a name alive over a door was worth going into a kind of debt that would take a decade to climb out of. She thought about Nathaniel exactly once, standing there in the dark, and made herself stop. He had a wedding in 3 weeks. He had a company, a mother, a merger, 1,100 jobs riding on a decision that had nothing to do with her, and whatever had happened between them in that walk-in refrigerator was a complication she could not afford to feed. She had learned, at 23, standing in a hospital corridor being told there was nothing more anyone could do, that wanting something badly had no bearing whatsoever on whether you got to keep it. She was not going to make that mistake twice, not with the restaurant, and certainly not with a man who belonged, however briefly and however unhappily, to someone else. She went back to the Ashcombe estate the following Thursday for the final walkthrough, because it was her job, because $400,000 didn't care about her feelings any more than the lease math did, and she wore the wall like armor the entire time. The rehearsal dinner itself happened 2 nights before that walkthrough, and Josephine spent all 4 hours of it in the service kitchen, close enough to hear the toasts through the swinging doors, without ever once looking through them. She heard Nathaniel Cole's measured, elegant remarks about legacy and partnership. She heard Marcus Ashcombe's booming, self-satisfied speech about 2 great families joining forces, delivered with the particular confidence of a man who had never once had to cook for 400 people to keep his name on a door. She did not hear Nathaniel's toast, because he hadn't given one, had excused himself, according to Priya's frantic whispering in the kitchen doorway, with a headache that everyone in the wedding party seemed to accept a little too readily, as though they'd all silently agreed not to ask what was actually wrong. Josephine plated the last dessert course, handed it off to a server, and did not let herself wonder where he'd gone. Nathaniel found her in the kitchen at the end of the walkthrough, alone, scraping cake crumbs off a cutting board she didn't need to clean. "You've been avoiding me. I've been working." "Josephine. Don't." She didn't turn around. "You said what you said in the walk-in, and I heard you, and none of it changes anything, because in 3 weeks you're marrying someone else regardless of whether either of you loves her, and I am going to be standing 40 yards away in a service kitchen watching it happen, and I need you to let me do my job without whatever this is." "What if I don't marry her?" Now she turned around. "What? What if I call it off?" His voice was low, careful, like a man testing ice he wasn't sure would hold his weight. "Not for you. I need you to understand that. I'm not asking you to be the reason, because that's not fair to either of us, and it's not even true. I'd be calling it off because Vivian's in love with someone else and deserves to marry him, and because I've spent 18 months building my entire future on a foundation that was never going to hold either of us up. You're not the reason, Josephine. You're the reason I finally noticed the foundation was cracked. And your mother? The board? The 1,100 jobs? I don't know yet." He said it plainly, without flinching from it. "I don't have that solved. I might lose the merger. I might lose my mother's trust, at least for a while. I might have to rebuild Cole Whitfield's capital position from a much weaker footing than my father left it in. I know all of that. I'm telling you anyway, because I'm done deciding my whole life based on what's safest for everyone except me." Josephine set down the cutting board. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were shaking. "I have 1 week to find $68,000, or I lose my father's restaurant. I don't have room in my life right now for a man who might blow up a merger for reasons he swears aren't about me. I'm not asking you to have room for it. I'm asking you to know it's true." She didn't answer. She picked the cutting board back up, and this time, when she turned away from him, he let her. Nathaniel Cole requested a private lunch with her son 4 days before the wedding, at the house where Nathaniel had grown up, in the same dining room where his father used to sit at the head of the table, reading the Financial Times without looking up. She did not raise her voice, because Nathaniel Cole never raised her voice. She simply set down facts, one after another, like place settings. "I know about the chef," she said. Nathaniel didn't insult either of them by pretending not to understand. "I also know," Eleanor continued, "that you haven't looked at Vivienne the way you look at that young woman in nearly 2 years of knowing her. And I knew that before you did, because I am your mother, and I notice things you think you're hiding." She folded her hands. "I want you to understand something about your father, Nathaniel, that you never got the chance to see, because he'd already built the company by the time you were old enough to watch him build anything." "What's that?" "He married me for love. Not for the merger everyone assumes it was. The Whitfield name attached itself to the company 2 years after the wedding, when your father's business partner retired and I inherited his stake. Your father married a girl from a family with no capital and no name at all, because he loved her, and he built an empire around that decision instead of the other way around." She looked at him steadily. "I let people believe otherwise for 30 years, because it was simpler, and because after he died, the story of the merger felt like the last structure I had left standing. I have spent 18 months trying to build you the same kind of stability your father built me, through the only method I understood, which was architecture instead of love. I think I built you a very beautiful cage, Nathaniel, and I am sorry for it." "Mother?" "Vivienne came to see me yesterday," Eleanor said. "She cried in this exact chair. She's in love with a man named Robert Aiken, the Ashcombs estate manager, and she has been for 3 years, and she has been terrified of telling anyone because her father would destroy his career and probably his family's home. She asked me if there was any way out of this wedding that didn't end both of your lives in ruins." Nathaniel thought of Vivienne at the last 3 dinners they'd shared. The way her eyes had drifted to her phone every time it buzzed, the small, private smile she'd tried and failed to hide, the way she'd once mentioned, almost in passing, that the estate's grounds had gotten so much better since Robert took over the gardens, in a tone that had nothing to do with hedges. He'd noticed all of it and filed it away as none of his business, the same way he suspected she'd noticed things about him and Josephine, and said nothing, both of them trapped in the same polite architecture, both too afraid of the collapse to test its walls. "What did you tell her?" he asked again. "I told her I'd handle it," Eleanor said, "because it turns out I am considerably better at fixing weddings than I am at building them honestly in the first place. Marcus Ashcombe needs Cole Whitfield's capital position regardless of whose signature is on a marriage license. I restructured the terms this morning as an investment partnership instead. It costs us slightly more in equity. It costs you nothing you actually wanted to keep." She reached across the table and, for the first time since the funeral, took her son's hand. "Go to your chef, Nathaniel. Do it properly. Don't blow up a wedding in front of 400 guests like it's a television drama. That would be needlessly cruel to Vivienne, who deserves better than a public spectacle on top of everything else. But go to her, today, before you talk yourself back into the cage." Nathaniel spent the walk from his mother's house turning the conversation over in his mind, and by the time he reached his car, he understood that there was still one more piece of architecture he had to dismantle before anything else could be true. He drove to the Ashcombe estate first, not to Sycamore Street. He found Vivienne in the small conservatory off the east wing, arranging flowers that weren't for the wedding, humming something under her breath that stopped the second she saw his face. "You know," she said. It wasn't a question. "My mother told me, about Robert." Vivienne set down her shears very carefully, like she was setting down something that might shatter if handled wrong. "I was going to go through with it, Nathaniel. I want you to know that. Not because I don't love him. God, I do. But because I didn't see another way that didn't end with someone getting hurt. You, me, him, my father, your mother. I ran the numbers the same way you probably have, 100 different times, and marrying you was always the answer that hurt the fewest people. It would have hurt you the most. I'd made my peace with that. She looked at him, steady, older in that moment than her 26 years. You didn't come here to comfort me. You came here to tell me something. Say it. I don't want to marry you, Nathaniel said, gently as he could manage. Not because there's anything wrong with you, because I don't love you, and you don't love me, and we both deserve a life that isn't built entirely out of other people's spreadsheets. Something in Vivian's shoulders came down, an inch, like a held breath finally let go. There's a woman, she said. The chef. I've seen how you look at her during the tastings. I don't think you know you do it. I used to feel guilty about it, and then I realized the guilt was backwards. I should have been grateful. You looking at someone else the way you never once looked at me was the only honest thing about this entire engagement. I'm sorry, Nathaniel said, for all of it. For not saying something sooner. Don't be sorry. Vivian picked her shears back up, and for the first time in 18 months, she actually smiled at him, not the polished, practiced smile she wore for photographs, but something looser and more real. Go tell her, and Nathaniel. Tell her before you tell the press, before you tell the board, before you tell anyone whose reaction matters more to your ego than hers matters to your heart. You have a bad habit of managing people's feelings like line items. Don't do it to her. He left the conservatory 10 minutes later with his phone already in his hand. Josephine was in the alley behind Marlowe and daughter, sitting on the same overturned milk crate, when her phone rang with a number she'd deleted 3 times and resaved 3 times over the past 2 weeks. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. I called off the wedding, Nathaniel said. No preamble at all. Officially, this morning. Vivian's marrying someone she actually loves. My mother restructured the merger without a marriage attached to it, and I am currently standing outside a restaurant on Sycamore Street that I have been told has excellent lamb, wondering if the owner would consider a customer who has absolutely no ulterior professional motive this time. Josephine stood up so fast the milk crate tipped over. She rounded the corner of the alley, and there he was, on the sidewalk in front of Marlowe and daughter. No suit, no driver, just a man in a plain gray sweater, holding a folded piece of paper like it mattered more than anything he'd ever held in a boardroom. What is that? She said, nodding at the paper, because it was easier than saying anything about his face right now. It's a check. He held it out. For $68,000. Made out to your landlord, not to you. I looked up the amount. I hope that's not. I know you said you don't need me to fix your problems, so I want to be very clear about what this actually is. It's not rescue. It's a business loan, at whatever interest rate you want to set, with whatever repayment terms you want to set. Because I would like this restaurant to still exist in 6 months, and not because I'm trying to buy anything from you. I'm trying to buy time. Time for you to figure out if you want anything to do with a man who just walked away from a merger 4 days before his own wedding because he couldn't stop thinking about someone who told him his acidity was off. Josephine looked at the check. She looked at him. You're an idiot, she said. You don't loan a business owner $68,000 4 days after calling off a wedding. You wait. You let things settle. You let her figure out her own feelings without a check in the middle of it, complicating everything. You're right, Nathaniel said. I know that. I did it anyway, because I've spent 18 months being the version of myself that waits for things to settle and calculates the safest possible move, and I am extremely tired of that person. I would like to try being someone who says the true thing at the wrong time instead of the careful thing at the right one, for once in my life. Starting now, I love you. I have loved you since a scallop and an opinion about acidity in a kitchen I had no business standing in. I'm not telling you that because of the check, and I'm not telling you that because I need an answer today. I'm telling you because I promised myself, standing outside your restaurant for 11 minutes before I worked up the nerve to call you, that I would say the true thing instead of the safe one, and this is the true thing. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a delivery truck idled. Josephine Marlowe, who had built her entire adult life on the principle that she did not need rescuing, stood on the sidewalk in front of her father's restaurant and looked at a man holding a check he clearly expected her to be angry about, and felt something in her chest unclench that had been clenched for 6 years. "Tear it up," she said. His face fell, just slightly. "Tear it up," she repeated, "and come inside instead, and let me cook you dinner that has nothing to do with a contract, and we can talk about a loan tomorrow, on my terms, with actual paperwork and an actual interest rate, like adults. Tonight I don't want you to be a client or a rescue plan. I want you to just be a man who noticed my acidity was off." Nathaniel Cole tore the check in half, then in half again, and put the pieces in his pocket, and followed Josephine Marlowe through the door of a narrow restaurant with her father's name still painted over it, into a kitchen that smelled like 6 years of grief and stubbornness, and, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the beginning of something neither of them had to perform. 6 months later, Marlowe and daughter reopened under a new lease in October, $68,000 repaid in full, over 11 months at 4% interest, a rate Josephine had insisted on, and Nathaniel had tried, unsuccessfully, to negotiate downward. The dining room had 18 tables now instead of 11, and a private room in the back that hosted, on its opening weekend, a very small wedding, 22 guests, no string quartet, a menu of scallops and dark chocolate espresso cake, and a bride who spent most of the ceremony laughing instead of crying, because Nathaniel Cole had written his own vows and gotten the acidity joke wrong on purpose, just to hear her correct him one more time. Eleanor Cole sat in the second row. She did not cry either, but she held her son's hand tightly enough, at one point, that he had to gently remind her he needed it back to hold his bride's. Vivian Ashcombe sent a card. It said simply, "Thank you for letting both of us tell the truth." The restaurant sign still said Marlowe and daughter. Josephine had never painted over it, and now she never would, because some nights, standing in the kitchen with her husband perched on a stool at the pass, eating scraps off a spoon like a man with nowhere else in the world he needed to be, she thought her father would have liked knowing the name outlasted the grief that had kept it there. If you loved watching two people choose the true thing over the safe one, you know what to do. Subscribe, ring that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next story.